Welcome to this channel. At the sum of 1,000 subscribers, I will post a series of special stories for you. Subscribe. The hum of the facility's automated systems was the only sound that accompanied the cold, lifeless walls of the underground research station. Located miles beneath the surface of an inhospitable planet, the station had been designed for one purpose: containment. But the stillness in the air today felt wrong, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Dr. Alana Krysek stood on the elevated observation platform, her eyes locked on the reinforced cage that hung suspended in the containment chamber below. Her heart pounded, despite her attempts to calm herself with logic. It had been 4 long years since they captured subject X-101, yet every time she looked at the creature, she felt a wave of unease settle over her, as if it were watching her even while in its stasis. Today marked the anniversary of its arrival. She could remember that day clearly, the anticipation, the excitement. They had caught something extraordinary, something alien. It was a discovery that would propel the facility, and Krysek herself, into the scientific limelight. X-101 had been found on a mining expedition on Proxima b, a world thought to be barren. The miners had uncovered its slumbering form deep beneath the surface, encased in a crystalline structure that seemed both ancient and unnatural. The creature was alive, though barely. It had been shipped back to the facility with extreme caution, kept under heavy sedation for the entirety of its journey. When they first opened the containment pod, Krysek had been both horrified and fascinated by what lay within. X-101 had no recognizable features by human standards: no eyes, no mouth, just a mass of glistening, translucent flesh that shimmered in the dim light. It was vaguely amphibious in appearance, a bizarre fusion of reptilian and insectoid traits. Its skin oozed a slimy secretion, and its movements had been slow, almost lethargic. "It's beautiful, in a way," Krysek had whispered back then, awe overcoming her initial fear. But that wonder faded as the years passed. The first few months were marked by vigorous study. The team conducted every test imaginable: probes, scans, biopsies. It didn't respond. It didn't fight back. It didn't even flinch. Soon, the lack of response from the creature led to frustration among the researchers. They had captured a potentially groundbreaking life form, yet it offered no clues, no breakthroughs. Then came the shutdown. About 6 months into its captivity, X-101 stopped moving altogether. It curled up into a fetal position, as if retreating into itself. It ceased to consume the nutrient fluids they provided, ignored stimuli, and settled into a complete state of inactivity. "We've killed it," Dr. Raymond Lasker, the head of security, had said one day, shaking his head in disbelief. "All our prodding, and now it's just done." But Krysek wasn't convinced. The creature's vitals remained stable, and there was something about its stillness that didn't sit right with her. It felt deliberate. That was when the excrement began to build up. At first, the scientists were puzzled. The waste matter was dense and hard, like calcified stone. They observed as it began to form around the creature's body, layer after layer, almost like a shell. The substance hardened quickly, creating a grotesque cocoon of waste, until X-101 was completely encased. The other scientists had written it off as a biological quirk, an involuntary response to captivity. "It's shutting down," they said. "Going into some kind of hibernation." But Krysek suspected something more. The layers of excrement were not random, they formed in geometric patterns, slowly becoming structured, almost like armor. It was as though the creature was protecting itself. Or preparing, Krysek often thought, though she never voiced it aloud. Now, for years later, the creature remained encased in its grotesque shell, like a bizarre statue in the center of the containment chamber. The once smooth surface had become jagged and spiked, hardened beyond anything they could explain. "We've wasted 4 years," Lasker said, breaking Krysek's thoughts. He stood beside her on the observation platform, his face a mask of frustration. "All our resources, all this time, and it's just sitting there, covered in its own filth. What kind of breakthrough is this supposed to be?" It's still alive, Krysek replied quietly, never taking her eyes off the creature. We don't understand its biology. What if this is a form of metamorphosis? Lasker scoffed. Metamorphosis into what? A walking turd with spikes? Krysek frowned but said nothing. She had argued this point too many times already. The others were losing patience, and funding for the project was being threatened. If they didn't get results soon, the board of directors would pull the plug on X-101 and order its termination. Deep down, Krysek felt that would be a grave mistake. Look at the readings, she said, gesturing toward the hollow screen projected before them. It's emitting energy low levels, yes, but it's consistent. It's like it's in a stasis, waiting for something. Lasker shook his head. For years in stasis doesn't get us grant money, Krysek. We need something tangible. He turned to leave, but as he did, a soft tremor ran through the observation platform. Krysek's eyes widened. Did you feel that? She asked, her voice laced with sudden urgency. Lasker stopped, turning back. What? Another tremor, stronger this time. The ground beneath them shook, and the lights flickered overhead. A distant rumbling filled the chamber, and the air grew thick with static. It's happening, Krysek whispered, her heart racing. Lasker frowned, stepping toward the edge of the platform, his hand reaching instinctively for his sidearm. Below them, in the containment chamber, the thick layers of hardened excrement that coated X-101 began to crack. Jesus! Lasker muttered, his voice barely audible. The cracks spread, webbing across the creature's shell, and a low, ominous hum filled the room. The viewing screens flared to life, displaying erratic energy readings. Inside the shell, something was moving. Dr. Alana Krysek stood frozen in place, her mind racing with both fear and excitement. After 4 years of silence, the creature was waking up. And it wasn't the same as when they first found it. The air in the facility thickened with tension as the tremors intensified, shaking the entire underground structure. Dr. Alana Krysek stood paralyzed on the observation platform, watching in awe and fear as the cracks in X-101's hardened shell deepened. Fragments of the waste-turned armor began falling away, revealing slivers of the creature's slick, pulsating flesh beneath. It was unmistakable now X-101 was moving. A deep, low-frequency hum reverberated through the containment chamber, so low that it was barely perceptible to human ears, but the sensors went wild. Hollow screens flared up, showing jagged spikes in the energy readings, pulses of alien frequencies that no one had detected before. Krysek's heart raced, both thrilled and terrified by what was happening. It's waking up. Krysek shouted over the rumbling, her voice filled with a mixture of exhilaration and fear. It's been in stasis this whole time, waiting for this moment. Dr. Raymond Lasker, the head of security, was less enthused. He grabbed the railing beside Krysek, his knuckles white as the platform shook beneath them. His instincts screamed danger. We need to shut it down. Lasker barked, already reaching for his comm device. Get the tranquilizer drones in here, now. Krysek shook her head, her eyes locked on the creature below. No. We can't interfere, it's too risky. We don't know what it's doing. I don't care what it's doing, Lasker shot back, his voice laced with urgency. It's breaking out of its cage, and that's enough for me. Before anyone could argue further, a sharp, piercing sound filled the chamber. It was as if the air itself was being torn apart, and the shell around X-101 began to emit a strange, eerie glow. The lights flickered again, and then went out entirely, plunging the facility into darkness. Only the dull, red emergency lighting remained, casting the scene in an ominous glow. In the dim light, Krysek could see the creature's outline becoming more distinct as it shrugged off the last remnants of its cocoon. The shell that had once encased X-101 in filth had transformed into something else, something terrifyingly efficient. Thick, spiked plates of the hardened excrement had fused to its body like armor, each section interlocking, forming an exoskeleton that shimmered with a metallic sheen. What had once been a vulnerable, fleshy creature was now something far more dangerous. Tranquilizer drones online, a robotic voice chimed in over the intercom, and within seconds, a swarm of drones covered into the containment chamber, the tranquilizer darts aimed at X-101. Lasker leaned forward, gripping the railing tightly. "Sedate it before it can break out," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. The drones fired in unison, launching their darts at the creature's exposed flesh. The darts made contact with the pulsing skin beneath the armor, but before anyone could breathe a sigh of relief, X-101 responded. The creature let out a guttural, inhuman screech that reverberated through the facility, sending shockwaves through the air. The sound was so loud, so primal, that Krysek instinctively covered her ears, wincing in pain. The tranquilizer darts that had pierced its skin seemed to have no effect. Instead, the creature's body convulsed violently, and its armor began to shift. The spiked plates of hardened waste seemed to pulse and expand, growing even thicker and more jagged. They rearranged themselves, forming protective layers over the exposed areas where the darts had landed. The armor was alive, adapting. The tranquilizers were useless. "It's evolving," Krysek whispered in awe, her voice trembling. "The armor. It's not just waste. It's part of its body now. It's adapting to our attacks." Lasker cursed under his breath. "We need to evaluate. Now." Before Krysek could protest, the ground beneath them shuddered violently, and a deafening crash echoed through the chamber. X-101 had broken free of its restraints, its massive, armored form standing tall in the center of the room. The creature no longer resembled the weak, slimy alien they had captured 4 years ago. It was a towering, monstrous figure, its armor gleaming in the red emergency light like the shell of a predator ready to hunt. With one powerful swing of its clawed limb, X-101 smashed through the containment field's reinforced walls as if they were paper. Alarms blared throughout the facility, the klaxon wailing a warning of the breach. "Containment failure! Containment failure!" The robotic voice repeated the warning over and over, but there was no controlling the situation now. Krysek watched in horror as the creature moved with a speed that defied its size. Its once sluggish, almost helpless movements were now sharp and deliberate. It was no longer the passive test subject she had spent years studying. It had become something far more intelligent, far more dangerous. And it had been waiting for this exact moment. "What the hell is it doing?" Lasker muttered, his grip tightening on his plasma rifle. The creature wasn't rampaging blindly. It wasn't attacking indiscriminately. Instead, it moved with purpose, its head, if it could be called a head, tilting as if listening to something only it could hear. Then, with a powerful leap, X-101 smashed through another barrier, heading deeper into the facility. "It's going for the core," Krysek realized, her voice barely above a whisper. "It knows where it's going." Lasker turned to her, disbelief and anger flashing across his face. "What do you mean, it knows? This thing is a dumb animal, Krysek. It can't know where the core is." But Krysek shook her head, her mind racing. "It's been here for 4 years, Ray. We've been studying it, but what if it's been studying us? What if this whole time, it's been learning?" Before Lasker could respond, the intercom crackled to life with the panicked voice of one of the facility's technicians. "Dr. Krysek, security team. The creature is heading for the reactor. If it breaches the core, we're done." Lasker swore and looked back at Krysek. "We have to stop it. Now." Krysek nodded, though fear gnawed at her insides. "We need more than just plasma rifles. It's evolved beyond anything we can handle with conventional weapons." Lasker motioned to his team, already mobilizing the soldiers stationed throughout the facility. "You come up with a plan," he said grimly. "We'll hold it off as long as we can." But Krysek wasn't sure there was any holding it off. In just minutes, X-101 had shattered all their assumptions about its capabilities. The creature was intelligent, adaptable, and now armored in a way that made their strongest weapons ineffective. As Lasker and his team rushed toward the danger, Krycek stayed behind, frantically scanning through the facility's files. There had to be something, some clue about how to stop this thing. Her fingers flew across the holographic controls as she pulled up every shred of data they had gathered over the years. There were patterns, behavioral shifts, energy fluctuations, and, most importantly, biological signatures that pointed to a startling conclusion. The creature hadn't been dormant. It had been preparing. Her pulse quickened as she realized the full scope of what they were dealing with. X-101 wasn't just a random organism captured from an alien world. It was something far more advanced, something that had been waiting for the right moment to act. And that moment had come. But before she could process the implications, the lights flickered again, and the facility's automated voice rang out in a cold, robotic tone, "Containment breach imminent. Evaluate immediately." Krycek's heart sank. She knew what the creature was capable of now. If it reached the reactor, the entire facility and everything within it would be destroyed. She had no choice. If they couldn't stop X-101, the only option left was to make sure it never escaped the facility. "Computer," Krycek said, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her, "initiate lockdown protocol. If X-101 wanted to escape, it was going to have to fight through everything they had." The facility was in chaos. Red emergency lights flashed across the metallic corridors, bathing everything in a foreboding crimson glow. The shrill wail of alarms echoed through every hall, accompanied by the panicked shouts of personnel as they scrambled to find safety. Dr. Alana Krycek sprinted through the corridors, her heart pounding in her chest, barely able to keep pace with her racing thoughts. X-101 was free. She couldn't shake the image of the creature from her mind, the way it had shattered its containment like it was nothing, the spiked, armor-like shell that had formed around its body, the terrifying intelligence behind its movements. It wasn't just reacting blindly. It had a purpose, and that purpose was terrifyingly clear. Krycek's comm device crackled to life, Lasker's voice cutting through the noise. "Krycek, we're trying to hold it back, but this thing is tearing through everything. Plasma rifles barely even scratch it." She grimaced, dodging around a corner as she made her way to the central command hub. "I'm almost at the control center. We need to lock down the entire facility. We can't let it reach the reactor." "You think I don't know that?" Lasker shouted, the sound of gunfire echoing in the background. "Just get it done." Krycek pushed harder, her legs burning as she reached the heavy, reinforced door that led to the command center. The guards stationed outside let her through with frantic nods, knowing that the survival of the entire facility now depended on what she did next. The command hub was a frenzy of activity. Technicians and engineers were crowded around hollow screens, trying to make sense of the chaos erupting across the base. Monitors flickered with security footage of the containment chamber, now in ruins, and the creature moving through the facility like a force of nature. "Status," Krycek shouted as she entered the room, immediately pulling up the system controls on the central console. "Containment breaches in multiple sectors," one of the techs responded, his voice shaky. "The creature is heading directly for the reactor. We've sealed off sections B and C, but it's tearing through everything we throw at it." Krycek's fingers flew across the controls, activating lockdown protocols across the base. She watched as steel-reinforced doors slid into place, sealing off corridors and access points. The creature had been contained underground, but if it got past the reactor chamber, it would be unstoppable. "Begin core lockdown," she ordered, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her insides. The technician hesitated. "But, Dr. Krycek, if we initiate a full lockdown on the reactor, we'll dash." "Do it!" Krycek snapped. "That thing reaches the surface, and it's game over. We can't risk it." The technician nodded and keyed in the command. Across the base, heavy blast doors began to slide into place, sectioning off the core from the rest of the facility. It would be a temporary solution at best, but they needed every second they could get. Krycek turned back to the main screen, watching the security feed. X-101 was on the move, its hulking form smashing through barriers and walls like they were made of paper. The drones and soldiers that stood in its way were torn apart with brutal efficiency. The plasma rounds fired by the security team bounced off its hardened shell with little more than a flicker. The creature was evolving faster than she'd imagined. Every attack, every defensive measure the team threw at it was met with immediate adaptation. The spiked armor covering its body had grown denser, thicker, almost organic in its movements. It was as though the creature was absorbing their tactics, learning from each attempt to stop it. "We need to stop it before it reaches the core," Lasker's voice crackled over the comm again, this time with even more desperation. "It's too strong. We can't hold it." Krycek's mind raced. What could they possibly do to stop something that adapted to every attack? There had to be a weakness, some flaw they hadn't seen yet. As she stared at the data streaming across the screens, a memory flashed in her mind: the creature's exoskeleton, that thick layer of hardened waste. It had started as an accumulation of filth, but over time, it had transformed into something protective. Something biological. But beneath that armor, X-101 was still a living organism. It needed to metabolize, to process the nutrients it had consumed. "What if we target its biological needs?" she muttered to herself, her thoughts spinning. She quickly accessed the facility's inventory logs. If the creature had evolved to be nearly indestructible from the outside, they would need to attack it from within. The facility had stores of hypercorrosive acid used for mining operations on hostile planets, designed to break down the toughest materials. If they could get that into the creature's system. "Krycek?" Lasker's voice broke her concentration. "We can't hold it much longer." "I have an idea," she responded, her voice steadying. "We can't destroy its armor, but we might be able to bypass it. We've got stores of hypercorrosive acid. If we can get it into the creature's body through a breach in the armor or some kind of weak point, we might be able to take it down from the inside." Lasker didn't sound convinced. "Acid? And how exactly are we supposed to inject it into that thing? It's wearing a damn tank as a shell." "We'll have to lure it into a trap," Krycek replied, her mind working rapidly. "There's a storage facility near Sector E14, just ahead of where it's heading. We can flood the area with the acid and force it to walk through." There was a brief pause on the line, then Lasker's voice came through, grim but resolute. "It's a long shot, but it's better than nothing. We'll set the trap. You just make sure the acid's ready." Krycek nodded, adrenaline surging through her. She issued commands to the technicians, directing them to reroute the acid stores to Sector E14. This was their last chance. If the acid didn't work, there would be nothing left to stop X-101 from reaching the core, and once it had access to the reactor, there would be no telling the devastation it could unleash. As the team hurried to set up the trap, Krycek watched the security feeds with bated breath. X-101 moved closer and closer to the designated sector, smashing through the last of the facility's defenses. Each step was calculated, deliberate. The creature wasn't just mindlessly rampaging, it knew what it was doing. Her comm crackled again. "We're in position," Lasker reported. "Drones are armed, and the acid's ready. Just give the word." Krycek's pulse quickened. "Wait for my signal. We need it to be directly over the trap." The moments stretched on, agonizingly slow. X-101 moved through the final corridor, its massive, armored form filling the screens. It was larger now than it had been when first captured, its body pulsing with a strange energy that Krycek couldn't explain. "Now," she shouted. Lasker gave the order, and the ceiling above X-101 exploded with a shower of acid, cascading down onto the creature's armored form. The corrosive liquid hissed and bubbled as it made contact with the hardened exoskeleton, eating away at the outer layers. The creature shrieked in pain, a sound that pierced through the entire facility. But as the acid burned through its armor, Chrysek's heart sank. X-101 wasn't collapsing, it was adapting again. The creature's body convulsed violently, and the plates of its armor shifted once more, hardening into new configurations, forming protective barriers that slowed the acid's progress. It wasn't enough to kill it. Damn it! Lasker shouted over the comm, it's still moving. Chrysek's mind raced. They had one last option. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but there was no other choice. Prepare to initiate the self-destruct sequence, she ordered, her voice heavy with the weight of the decision. Lasker's voice was strained. You're talking about blowing up the whole facility. Chrysek closed her eyes for a moment, steeling herself. If that thing reaches the surface, it won't stop. We can't let it escape. This is our only chance. There was a long pause, and then Lasker's voice came through, resigned but resolute. Understood. Chrysek entered the override codes into the control system. Her fingers trembled as she keyed in the final sequence. Core detonation in 5 minutes, the automated voice announced. As the countdown began, Chrysek stared at the screen, watching as X-101 continued to thrash, still fighting its way toward the core. They had tried everything. But in the end, the only way to stop the creature was to destroy everything X-101, the facility, and possibly themselves. But they had to do it. Because if they didn't, the consequences would be far worse. The final moments ticked away, and Chrysek took one last look at the creature that had consumed her life for the last 4 years. It had been a discovery unlike any other, a creature beyond their understanding. And now it was going to die along with them. The countdown echoed in Dr. Chrysek's mind, each second a hammer stroke against her consciousness. For minutes until core detonation, the automated voice declared, cold and emotionless. Alana Chrysek stood in the central command hub, staring at the flickering holoscreens, her body frozen but her mind racing. The enormity of what was about to happen pressed down on her. They had spent years trying to understand X-101, probing, testing, and learning. All that knowledge, all those efforts wiped out in an explosion that would leave nothing but smoldering ruins beneath the planet's surface. Yet, there was no alternative. X-101 wasn't just a biological anomaly, it was something far more terrifying, something that had been waiting, planning. If it escaped the facility, it wouldn't stop. It was intelligent, adaptive, and far too dangerous to be allowed into the wider universe. She keyed her comm device and spoke to Lasker, her voice resolute but thick with regret. "How's the team?" Lasker's voice crackled over the line. "We're getting the last of the personnel out now. Most of us have evaluated to the upper levels, but the elevators are down. We're doing this the old-fashioned way stairs." Chrysek winced. "We're cutting it close." "Yeah, no kidding," Lasker muttered, breathing heavily. "You've got 3 minutes left. We'll make it topside by then. What about you?" Chrysek glanced at the override panel. The final sequence had already been entered. Once the timer hit 0, there would be no stopping the explosion. The entire facility would collapse in on itself, and with it, X-101. "I'm staying," she said quietly. A long silence followed on the comm. "You don't have to do this, Chrysek. We can get out. There's still time." She shook her head, even though Lasker couldn't see her. "This is my responsibility. I'm the reason X-101 is here. I'm the one who pushed for the research, who kept it alive for so long. I can't walk away." Chrysek, Lasker's voice softened, a rare moment of compassion breaking through his usual tough exterior. "You can't blame yourself for this. None of us knew what that thing was capable of." "Maybe," she replied, her voice distant. "But I saw the signs. I knew it was evolving, adapting. I ignored it because I wanted to understand it. And now? Well, now it's going to kill us all unless I stop it. 2 minutes until core detonation." The computer's voice pulled her back to the present. She looked up at the holoscreens again. X-101 had reached the final barrier, the thick blast door leading to the reactor core. It slammed its armored body against the door, over and over, with terrifying force. Each impact sent shudders through the facility, rattling the walls and shaking the command center. Kreisig knew that door wouldn't hold much longer. The acid had slowed X-101, but not enough. The creature was relentless, its armored exoskeleton shifting and reforming to compensate for the damage. It was adapting faster than they could react. But they only needed 2 more minutes. Kreisig activated the security feed to get a final look at the creature. Its massive, spiked body loomed in the dim light of the reactor chamber, each movement deliberate and precise. The armor, once grotesque and irregular, had become a sleek, almost metallic shell, covering every vulnerable part of its body. X-101 was no longer just an alien organism, it was a living weapon, a fortress of biological engineering. As she watched, the creature paused for a moment, its body shuddering. Kreisig leaned in closer, her brow furrowing. It was as if X-101 could sense what was coming. For the first time, it seemed uncertain, as though it knew the stakes had changed. "It's aware," she whispered to herself, horror twisting in her gut. Suddenly, the creature turned its head, or what passed for its head, toward one of the security cameras. Kreisig's blood ran cold as its many black, beady eyes seemed to focus on her. It was impossible it couldn't know where she was, couldn't know she was watching it through the screens. But it did. The intelligence behind those eyes was unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat as X-101 let out a deafening, guttural roar, a sound so primal and powerful that it made the entire facility tremble. The walls cracked, dust raining down from above. And with one final, cataclysmic blow, the creature slammed itself against the blast door, bending the thick metal inward. "Kreisig." Lasker's voice came through the comm again, sharp with urgency. "Get out of there now. That thing's going to break through." "I know," she whispered, her fingers hovering over the control panel. "But I need to make sure it stays here." She had one last move to make. The facility's self-destruct would collapse the core, but there was another way to ensure X-101 was trapped. Kreisig pulled up the manual control for the blast doors. If she could seal off the outer layers of the core, it would contain the explosion, preventing any chance of escape. But she'd have to activate the sequence manually from inside the core chamber. Her heart raced as she keyed in the final commands. 1 minute until core detonation. "Kreisig, you don't have time." Lasker yelled, his voice frantic. "What the hell are you doing?" "I'm making sure it ends here," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Tell everyone I'm sorry." Before Lasker could respond, she shut off the comm, silencing his protests. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her access card and headed toward the door that led into the reactor chamber. The facility groaned around her, the vibrations from X-101's assault growing stronger. She could hear the creature's inhuman screeches just beyond the walls as it tore through the last remnants of the containment. Kreisig pushed forward, her body moving on instinct. She reached the door to the reactor room and swiped her access card. With a hiss, the door slid open, revealing the glowing reactor core, a massive column of energy pulsing in the center of the chamber. The air hummed with power, and the heat from the core made the room almost unbearably hot. Kreisig could barely think through the noise, the alarms, and the pressure building inside her chest. 30 seconds until core detonation. X-101 slammed into the door behind her, its claws raking against the metal. Kreisig moved quickly to the control console beside the reactor, her hands flying over the keys as she input the manual override. 20 seconds. The door behind her buckled, screeching under the weight of X-101's blows. She could hear the creature's shrill cries, feel the vibrations in the floor as it pounded against the last barrier between them. 10 seconds. She hit the final button, sealing the blast doors around the core. The reactor pulsed violently, the energy within reaching a critical threshold. Krysek took one last look at the control screen, her heart pounding as the countdown reached its final moments. 3, 2, 1. The world exploded in fire and light. The reactor core detonated with a blinding flash, the shock wave tearing through the facility with unimaginable force. The walls crumbled, the floors shattered, and the ceiling caved in as the entire structure collapsed in on itself. The blast consumed everything in its path: X-101, the research facility, and Dr. Alana Krysek. For a moment, there was nothing but destruction. A roaring inferno of energy and debris swallowed everything. Then, silence. Miles beneath the surface of the planet, the facility was gone, reduced to nothing but rubble and ash. X-101's screams were silenced, its body buried beneath tons of debris, trapped forever in the wreckage of the research station. The explosion left no trace of the nightmare that had unfolded, no sign of the creature that had nearly escaped. But deep below the rubble, beneath the layers of destruction, something still pulsed faintly. A small shard of X-101's armor, still glowing with the alien energy that had fueled its evolution, lay dormant in the wreckage. Waiting for the right moment to awaken once again.